Welcome to Double Double 2 Stories by Aliachish. Today's story is what Eisenhower said at night before D-Day. Now let me hand it over to my assistant Bob.
My name is Bob. I'm Ilya's assistant, and today I'm going to tell you about the loneliest night of Dwight Eisenhower's life. June 5th, 1944, Portsmouth, England, Supreme Allied Headquarters. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe, sits alone in his office, staring at weather reports. Outside, a storm is raging across the English Channel. Rain pounds against the windows. Wind howls through the trees. And in ports and airfields across southern England, more than 150,000 men are waiting for Eisenhower to make the most important decision of the entire war. Should Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, go forward tomorrow morning as planned, or should it be postponed, possibly for weeks, maybe even months? The weather is terrible. His meteorologist says there might be a brief window of slightly better conditions tomorrow morning. Might be. No guarantees. If Eisenhower orders the invasion and the weather doesn't improve, thousands of men will die in the surf. Ships will be lost. Aircraft will crash. The entire operation could fail catastrophically. But if he postpones, he loses the element of surprise. The Germans will discover the massive buildup. The invasion might have to wait until July or even next year. Eisenhower is the supreme commander, but in this moment he has never felt more alone. The decision is his and his alone. No one can make it for him. This is the story of what Eisenhower said the night before D-Day, and how one man carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. To understand the burden Eisenhower carried that night, you need to understand what Operation Overlord meant. This wasn't just another military operation. This was the most important invasion in human history. The operation that would determine whether Nazi Germany would be defeated or whether the war would drag on for years with unimaginable casualties. By June 1944, the Allies had been planning the invasion of France for more than 2 years. Stalin had been demanding a second front in Europe since 1942. The Soviet Union was bearing the terrible weight of fighting Germany on the Eastern Front, suffering millions of casualties. Stalin wanted the Western Allies to invade France and force Germany to fight on 2 fronts simultaneously. But invading France was extraordinarily difficult. The English Channel is one of the most treacherous bodies of water in the world. The Germans had spent 4 years fortifying the French coast with the Atlantic Wall, a massive system of bunkers, obstacles, mines, and artillery positions designed to throw any invasion back into the sea. An invasion required perfect coordination between naval forces landing troops, air forces providing cover and attacking German positions, and ground forces securing beachheads and pushing inland. Everything had to work together precisely, and all of it depended on the weather. The invasion needed low tides to expose German obstacles so they could be destroyed. It needed moonlight the night before so paratroopers could see to drop. It needed reasonable visibility for aircraft and naval bombardment. And it needed waves calm enough that landing craft could reach the beaches without capsizing. These conditions only occurred together for a few days each month. In June 1944, the ideal window was June 5th, 6th, and 7th. After that, the tides and moon would be wrong until July. Eisenhower had originally scheduled the invasion for June 5th. Hundreds of thousands of men had been assembled. Ships had been loaded. Aircraft had been fueled and armed. The massive machinery of Operation Overlord had been set in motion, and then the weather turned bad. On June 3rd and 4th, a major storm system moved into the English Channel. High winds, heavy rain, rough seas. Exactly the conditions that would make an amphibious invasion impossible. Eisenhower's chief meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, a British officer, came to Eisenhower on the evening of June 4th with devastating news. The storm would continue through June 5th. The invasion scheduled for the next morning would have to be postponed. Eisenhower had no choice. He postponed the invasion by 24 hours, moving it to June 6th. But that created an agonizing question. What would the weather be like on June 6th? Stagg couldn't give a definitive answer. The storm would continue through June 5th, but there was a possibility, just a possibility, of a brief improvement in the early morning hours of June 6th. The winds might drop slightly. The clouds might lift enough for aircraft to operate. The seas might calm just enough for landing craft to make it to shore, but Stagg couldn't promise any of this. Weather forecasting in 1944 was imprecise. They had no satellites, no advanced computer models. They were reading atmospheric pressure, wind patterns, and making educated guesses about what might happen 12 or 24 hours in the future. So, on the evening of June 5th, Eisenhower faced the most difficult decision of his life. Launch the invasion tomorrow morning based on a possibility that weather conditions might improve just enough to give the operation a chance? Or postpone again, potentially for weeks, and lose surprise, momentum, and possibly the entire operation? Eisenhower called a meeting of his senior commanders for 9:30 p.m. on June 5th. The meeting took place at Southwick House, a manor house near Portsmouth that served as the forward headquarters for Operation Overlord. The commanders gathered in the library, a wood-paneled room with maps covering the walls. Present were the men who would execute the invasion: Admiral Bertram Ramsay, commanding naval forces; Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, commanding air forces; General Bernard Montgomery, commanding ground forces; and General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff. Also present was Group Captain Stagg, who would present the latest weather forecast. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone knew what was at stake. Eisenhower sat at the head of the table, chain-smoking, his face showing the strain of the past days. Stagg presented his forecast. The storm would continue through the night. But in the early morning hours of June 6th, there would be a break. The winds would drop somewhat. Cloud cover would decrease enough for aircraft to operate, though not ideal conditions. The seas would remain rough, but might be manageable for landing craft. It wasn't good news, but it wasn't catastrophic either. It was uncertainty. Eisenhower went around the table asking each commander for his opinion. Admiral Ramsay, the naval commander, said the seas would be rough, but his ships could handle it. The landing craft would have difficulty, but it was doable. Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory was pessimistic. He believed the cloud cover would prevent effective air support. He feared heavy casualties among paratroopers dropping in darkness with poor visibility. He recommended postponement. General Montgomery was confident. "I would say go," he said. His ground forces were ready. The men were prepared. Waiting would be worse than difficult weather. Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, was non-committal. He laid out the risks either way, but wouldn't make a recommendation. Eisenhower listened to all of them. Then he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rain and wind. The room fell silent. Everyone waited for the Supreme Commander's decision. After several minutes, Eisenhower turned back to face his commanders. "I am quite positive we must give the order," he said. "I don't like it, but there it is. I don't see how we can do anything else." The meeting ended around 10 p.m. The invasion would go forward in less than 7 hours. But Eisenhower wasn't done agonizing. He went back to his office alone. For the next several hours he sat at his desk, smoking cigarettes, reading reports, and carrying the weight of the decision he had just made. What was going through Eisenhower's mind during those lonely hours? We know from his later accounts and from those who saw him that night. He was thinking about the thousands of young men who would die tomorrow. Some would drown when their landing craft capsized in rough seas. Some would be cut down by German machine guns on the beaches. Some would be killed when their aircraft crashed in the storm. Eisenhower had just ordered all of this to happen. The blood would be on his hands. He was thinking about the possibility of failure. What if the weather didn't improve as Stagg predicted? What if the Germans had reinforced Normandy? What if the paratroopers landed in the wrong locations? What if the naval bombardment failed to suppress German defenses? There were 1,000 ways Operation Overlord could fail catastrophically, and if it failed, Eisenhower would be responsible, not Roosevelt, not Churchill, not the combined chiefs of staff. Him. He was the supreme commander. He had made the decision to go. If it failed, history would remember Dwight Eisenhower as the man who led the Allies to their greatest defeat. Sometime during those lonely hours, Eisenhower did something that revealed the depth of his anxiety and his sense of responsibility. He took out a piece of paper and wrote a short message to be released in case the invasion failed. The message read, "Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." Notice the careful wording. Eisenhower took full responsibility. My decision. It is mine alone. He didn't blame the weather. He didn't blame his commanders. He didn't blame the troops. If Operation Overlord failed, Eisenhower would accept complete personal responsibility for the disaster. He dated the message July 5th instead of June 5th, a small error that revealed how exhausted and stressed he was. He put the message in his wallet and didn't tell anyone about it. This message was discovered years later. Eisenhower never had to release it because the invasion succeeded. But the fact that he wrote it shows how real the possibility of failure was in his mind that night. Around midnight, Eisenhower left his office and drove to visit paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division who were preparing to board aircraft for their night drop into Normandy. These men would be among the first Americans to land in France, jumping from aircraft hours before the beach landings began. Eisenhower walked among the paratroopers, talking to them, shaking hands, trying to boost their morale. But he was also absorbing their youth, their courage, their trust in him. These young men, many of them barely 20 years old, were about to jump into darkness over enemy-occupied France. Many would not survive, and Eisenhower had ordered them to do it. One soldier later remembered Eisenhower asking him where he was from. "Pennsylvania, sir," the soldier replied. Eisenhower asked about his family, his training, whether he was ready. The soldier said, yes, sir, he was ready. Eisenhower wished him good luck and moved on to the next man. After spending about an hour with the paratroopers, Eisenhower watched them board their aircraft. He stood on the airfield as the C-47 transport planes took off one by one, their engines roaring, carrying the paratroopers toward France. He raised his hand in salute as each plane passed. He watched until the last aircraft disappeared into the stormy night sky. An aide who was with Eisenhower that night later reported that after the last plane departed, Eisenhower's shoulders sagged. The confident commander who had just inspired hundreds of paratroopers looked suddenly old and burdened. Well, Eisenhower said quietly, it's on. Eisenhower returned to headquarters. There was nothing more he could do. The invasion had been launched. More than 5,000 ships were crossing the channel. Thousands of aircraft were in the air. Paratroopers were dropping into Normandy, and Eisenhower could only wait for reports of success or disaster. He tried to sleep, but couldn't. He paced. He smoked. He waited for news. The hours before dawn on June 6th were agonizing. Every telephone call might bring news of catastrophe. Every delay in receiving reports increased his anxiety. Finally, as dawn broke on June 6th, reports began arriving. The paratroopers had landed, though scattered across Normandy. The naval bombardment had begun. The first waves of landing craft were approaching the beaches. The invasion was happening. The reports were mixed. At Utah Beach, American forces were landing with lighter than expected casualties. At Omaha Beach, the situation was desperate. German defenses were stronger than anticipated. Americans were pinned down on the beach, suffering terrible casualties. At the British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, landings were proceeding, but with heavy fighting. Eisenhower absorbed these reports with growing anxiety. Omaha Beach was particularly worrying. If the Americans couldn't get off Omaha, the entire invasion could stall. The Germans might be able to contain the beachhead and throw the Allies back into the sea. But as the morning progressed, the news from Omaha improved slightly. American troops were fighting their way off the beach, meter by meter. Reinforcements were landing. Naval gunfire was suppressing German positions. It was brutal and costly. But the beachhead was holding. By afternoon, it was clear that Operation Overlord had succeeded. All 5 beaches were secure. Allied forces were pushing inland. The Germans had been caught by surprise and were unable to mount an effective counterattack. The invasion that Eisenhower had agonized over, that he had almost postponed, that he had accepted full responsibility for, had succeeded. The weather had held just long enough. Stagg's forecast had been accurate. The brief window of better conditions had materialized exactly when needed. If Eisenhower had postponed again, waiting for perfect weather, the opportunity might have been lost for weeks. Years later, Eisenhower would reflect on the decision he made on June 5, 1944. He called it the most difficult decision of his life, far lonelier and more burdensome than anything he faced before or after. I never realized before the loneliness and isolation of a commander at a time when such a momentous decision has to be taken, he said. The advisors can advise, but the Supreme Commander alone must take the final decision. It was my decision and mine alone. What did Eisenhower say the night before D-Day? Publicly to his commanders, he said, I am quite positive we must give the order. I don't like it, but there it is. But privately, in the loneliness of his office, he wrote a message accepting full responsibility for potential disaster. And in visiting the paratroopers, he said goodbye to young men he was sending into battle, knowing many would die. The night before, D-Day revealed Dwight Eisenhower's character more clearly than any victory or triumph. He wasn't a brilliant tactical genius like Patton. He wasn't a careful planner like Montgomery. He was a man capable of making impossible decisions, accepting terrible responsibility, and carrying unbearable burdens without breaking. June 5, 1944. Eisenhower sits alone with the weight of the world on his shoulders. He makes the decision to launch the greatest invasion in history into uncertain weather. He accepts full responsibility for whatever happens. He visits the young men he's sending into battle. And then he waits through the longest night of his life to see if his decision was right. The invasion succeeded. But Eisenhower never forgot that night, never forgot the loneliness of command, never forgot the burden of sending men to their deaths. That's what it means to be Supreme Commander, not the glory or the medals or the parades, but the crushing weight of decisions that determine whether thousands of young men live or die. And having the strength to make those decisions anyway, even when you can't be certain they're right. Eisenhower had that strength. And on June 5, 1944, he proved it.